Well, before I launch into this, my wife suggested that I say something about how this talk came to be, because it doesn't have anything to do with the Museum of Russian Icons. But we traveled for 17, I taught at Boston College for 45 years, and for 17 years my wife and I would take groups of students to Paris, France for a month. One of the things that we would do is to go through the great cathedrals and the churches, among other things. And students would ask questions. Some of them were pretty informed questions. Some of them were motivated by the fact that most of them had not seen the inside of a church. And so they would say, well, what is this, And so it forced me to kind of think about this thing in a different way, because for 12 years I carpooled with two colleagues, one of whom used to pride himself on being a visual illiterate, he said. We used to drive the same road every day, and on this road there was a house that was painted kind of Chinese red on the front and canary yellow on the side. So when you would you drive down this road, you would see this red and yellow, and it was like hitting you in the face. And one day, one of us remarked about it, and our third friend said, "What house?" And we realized that he never noticed it before. It's the difference between looking and seeing. One of my favorite quotes is from a scientist named Albert Szent-Györgyi. He's a person who discovered vitamin C. And he said, discovery consists in seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what no one else has thought. And so as I thought about this stuff, I began to kind of do some research, and I realized that there was a lot about churches that I didn't know, mostly about the history of it. And so I thought it would be kind of interesting to sort of trace the development of these things, because when we walk into churches, especially if we go every week, after a while, the details sort of fade into the background. They become kind of like the noise level, and we don't think about them. And we miss a lot, because a church is really one of the only kinds of buildings that's been around for close to 2,000 years. And so we miss a lot of richness, and we miss that sense of historical connectedness. So with that as background, let me tell you about From Catacombs to Cathedrals. I suppose I could have called it From Catacombs to Churches, but cathedrals sounded a little classier. So with that information, let's start. You all know, presumably, that the earliest Christians were Jews. And so they worshipped in the temple and the synagogue. But eventually, as the ideas of Christianity began to develop, it became clear that they were radically different. And so Christians were no longer welcome in the synagogues, and so they began to meet in private homes. You can find references to this in the New Testament. So for example, in St. John's Gospel, it says, "They will expel you from the synagogues. In fact, the hour is coming when everyone who kills you will think that he is offering worship to God." Don't focus on the last half of that. It's just that the idea was Christians didn't feel comfortable worshiping in the synagogues because they realized that the tenets of their beliefs were significantly different. There are several places in the New Testament where they actually talk about churches meeting in homes. So in St. Paul's letter to Philemon, one of the lesser known ones, he says, to Philemon, our beloved and our co-worker, with Apphia, our sister, to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church that meets in your home. Now, think about for a second, if you were going to have a church meeting in your home, what are some of the things you'd like to have available to people? Well, you might have a place for people to get together and have a large assembly, for example, for Mass. You might want to have a place for instruction. You might want to have another place for mingling, and so on. Well, fortunately, we know what home churches look like, because in 1880, a team of archaeologists working along the Euphrates River discovered the ruins of a city called Dura Europos. It was a city of about 3,000 people, and it was a Roman outpost. It was fairly active city, but for whatever reason, around 265 AD, it was deserted. And so it disappeared to history until 1880. And so when they started a team of archaeologists from Yale began to excavate this, they realized that they had a large number of ruins. There were about, for example, 11 different pagan temples. There was also a beautifully preserved synagogue, and there were the ruins of a Christian house church. So let me show you some of the ruins. This is part of what the Christian house church looked like. And the archaeologists sort of built up a picture of what the church was. So here's a home. It's roughly U-shaped. It has a courtyard in the front. It has a little area in the back for teaching. If you were instructing people on how to, what they needed to know to become a Christian, you'd have a teaching area. You'd have a baptistry, a place where people would go to be baptized as adults. And you'd have an assembly room for what we would now call Mass, for example, in the church. So we know that there were a fair number of these house churches. Now, why did Christians meet in houses? Why didn't they just build churches? Well, simple reason, Christianity for the first 3 centuries of its existence was illegal. Okay? In the Roman Empire, it was illegal to be a Christian. And the reason that it was illegal was because somewhere along the way, the Romans, who were very tolerant about religion, they welcomed everyone's religion, but somewhere along the way, the emperors decided that it wasn't enough to be an emperor, you should also be God. And so, as a citizen, you had an obligation once a year to make an offering to the emperor. Well, for Christians, this was a non-starter, and so they refused to do that. The problem was, the Romans then saw them as disturbers of the public order, and at their worst as treasonous, so it was illegal to become a Christian. If you were a Christian and you were found out, you could be arrested, your property could be confiscated, and you might be sent to prison or you might be sent to the arena to die. We have some testimonies of this, but I should tell you first of all, in this baptistry, in the part of the house that was reserved for baptisms, there were several wall paintings. These are some of the earliest ones that we know. They're a little tough to see, but the one on the left is a woman drawing water from the well. If you remember the Gospels, there's a story in which Jesus encounters a woman drawing water from the well, and that's telling that story. This one, you can probably make out the outline of a boat here, and down here, wearing camouflage gear, so you can't really see him, is Jesus walking on the waters, and this is the parable of Jesus healing the man who was crippled. So for the first 3 centuries, most of the time, Christians met in private homes. What caused this to change? Well, before I say that, let me just say that at various times, there were persecutions that really intensified. One of the particularly intense ones was during the Emperor Diocletian's reign in the 3rd century. And many people were arrested. They were sent to the Colosseum, for example, to be fed to the animals. So it was not a great time to be a Christian. They were literally driven underground. So in Rome, they actually retreated to the catacombs for their worship services. The catacombs are huge underground cemeteries in Rome. And so Christians would live there, and when people were killed in the arenas, they would bring their remains back to the catacombs for burial. There are a lot of well-known martyrs. In the 2nd century, there was a bishop, Ignatius of Antioch, who was sent to be executed in Rome. And as he traveled from Antioch to Rome, he wrote several letters to Christian communities talking about his experiences and what he was looking forward to, not looking forward to in the sense that this was something he was really thrilled about, but what he expected to find. Well, as I said, martyrs' bones were retrieved from the arenas, and they were brought below ground into the catacombs. And in the catacombs, there were these rooms that were called cubicula, like cubicles in modern offices. And they were buried there. So this is an imagined scene of some martyr's bones being interred with the priest being read over them. It became a tradition in the Christian church to say Mass over the bones of a martyr. And so when churches began to be built, there was always the expectation that they would either be built above the grave of a martyr or that they would have a martyr's remains or relics there. In the Catholic Church, if you're a person old enough to remember, which I am unfortunately, there was a requirement that every altar have something called an altar stone. It was a small piece of stone with a martyr's relic in it, and that had to be in the altar in order for you to be able to say Mass. Priests, for example, in the military who went into battle areas carried a small stone with them that they would cover with a piece of cloth to say Mass. So that tradition from 2,000 years ago is alive and well today. Okay, what changed in the Christian church? Well, what changed was Constantine. Back in the 4th century, there were 4 emperors of the Roman Empire. There were 2 minor ones and 2 major ones. The major ones were a man named Maxentius, who ruled in Rome, and Constantine, who ruled in Constantinople. When he built the city, he modestly named it after himself. And a civil war broke out for dominance between the 2 of them. And in October 312, Constantine was getting ready to go into battle against Maxentius's army, and at the battle of what's called the Milvian Bridge. And the night before, he had a vision of an angel speaking to him, who said, "If you put this symbol on the shields of your soldiers, you'll be victorious." This looks like a P and an X. These are actually the Greek letters Chi and Rho. They're the first 2 letters of the name of Christ. So Constantine had his soldiers emblazon this on their shields, and in the battle that followed, they won. Maxentius was killed, and so Constantine emerged as the sole ruler of Rome. In 313, a few months later, out of gratitude for this, he published the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal. So Christians could now come out of the shadows. That meant they could begin to build churches. So Christianity began to grow. You know, once something becomes legal, there probably were many people who thought about being Christians but decided against it just because of the fact that they didn't want to go to jail or lose their possessions. But eventually, when it's legal, people begin to join. Christianity begins to grow, and you now can build churches above ground. Well, by 380, the Emperor Flavius Theodosius now decides to make Christianity the state religion. So Christianity, in the space of about 70 years, has gone from being illegal to being the state religion. Once something becomes the state religion, and the leader of the state has adopted this, there's a powerful incentive for people to become Christians. So all of a sudden, Christian communities begin to grow. And with that is a need for larger churches. Now you can build big churches if you know how to do it. The other thing that he did that created another incentive was that he gave privileges to clergy. So if you were a Christian clergy person, you were exempt from taxes, number 1. Number 2, you were exempt from the compulsory public services. You could be, ordinarily could be drafted to help build roads and so on. And then thirdly, you are exempt from trial in civil courts. So that tradition of clergy being tried in church courts and not civil courts is something that runs through history, and it comes to a climax with the fight between Thomas of Becket and King Henry II in England. And to some extent, we see echoes of that today in the, I will call, the late unpleasantness in the Catholic Church. Well, the problem with building big buildings is you have to be able to do it, and that produces some engineering problems. If you build a building like, uprights and then you put some beams across it, you run into problems. If you check with the town of Norfolk, I'm sure they'll tell you that there's a limit on how big an unsupported beam you can have. Once you have a beam and you make it longer and longer, it begins to sag, and eventually it collapses. That means if you want to build flat roof buildings, they either have to be very small, or they have to be long and narrow, or they have to have lots of interior columns. And you see this a lot in classical architecture. Here's a picture of the Parthenon in Greece. Can't tell much more than the outside of it from here, but here's a diagram of it. And if you look inside, you can see all these interior columns. Now, why would you not want to have interior columns inside of a big building? Well, if you've ever gone to the Boston Garden and found yourself in an obstructed seat with a girder in front of you, you would understand why. And that's particularly true in the case of Christian worship services, because if you have an altar, let's say at the other end of the room, you want everyone there to be able to see it. But if there are all these columns, you can't do that. So the question is, how do you build big buildings? Well, fortunately, the Romans had solved this problem by the invention of the Roman arch. What the Roman arch does is it replaces that flat section that gravity acts on with just this one little keystone here. And So this is the only horizontal section in the building, in the arch. Everything else is kind of these wedge shapes. These things push sideways. So what it does is it transfers the force all the way down onto these walls. That means you can build buildings that have pretty wide separations between the walls, because again, what that does is it transfers the force downward. And so with that, the Romans could build big buildings. So they built, the characteristic elements that you see in Roman architecture are the barrel vault and the so-called groin vault, and sometimes a sphere, a hemisphere. Okay, now, when Christians were looking for existing big buildings to use, they didn't want to use any of the temples, obviously, because of the connotations that they were temples of false gods. What they turned to was the basilica. Now, when we think of basilicas today, we probably think of churches. But a Roman basilica was actually a public building. Every big Roman city had one right in its forum, and it was a combination of law court, let's say business place, and socialization place. And essentially what it was a rectangle with a main central aisle, a series of pillars with two side aisles, and a semicircular opening at the end. If this reminds you a little bit of some churches you've been into, there's no accident there. In addition, so if you were a Roman citizen, you could come in here, you could meet people, you could do some business. If you had an issue with the law, you could go over here where the Roman governor would sit, and you could present your case. So it was like a law court. And then along these side aisles, there were little stalls where you could actually do some shopping. So it was kind of like a little mall for Romans. Here's the Basilica of Maxentius. This is an enormous basilica that sits in the Roman Forum. We were lucky enough to be there this summer, so this is Marjorie's photo. The only thing that remains of it is this wall and one side of it. But you can imagine how huge these things are by looking at these little people here who look like ants. There would have been another side looking just like this over here. It was called the Basilica of Maxentius because he was the person who built it up until 312 when he met his unfortunate fate. At that point, Constantine took it over and he modified it slightly. This is what Constantine's basilica looked like. At the end, where the Roman governor in one of the provinces would have sat, was a gigantic statue of Constantine. But because this was a law court and a civic building, it didn't have any religious connotations, so the church sort of took this over as the model for its churches. And so in the place where Constantine's statue would have sat is where the priest or the bishop officiating at Mass would sit. And then the congregation would be in the center here. So a basilica is just a large building. It's a large religious building. The difference between a basilica and a cathedral is that if it were the seat of a bishop, that bishop's chair would have been there, and the bishop's chair was called a cathedra. And so that's what a cathedral is. Cathedral is a large church that's presided over by a bishop. If it's not presided over by a bishop, then it's not a cathedral, it's a basilica. Here's an example of a basilica. This is in the neighborhood of Trastevere in Rome. It's the old medieval area, and if you look at you're actually looking down this main part of the church toward this apse, this curved center at the back. Beautiful. Now there was an arch above this, but they would put a flat ceiling in. So that's a typical church that would have been built by that Roman design. This is St. John Lateran's church in Rome. Again, a very elaborate one. But if you look at a cutaway diagram of it, you can see that it's still got those three aisles. So that becomes the classic model of a church. And if you think, as I said, about most of the churches you've been into, one way or another, they all have that same basic floor plan. Now, a church is essentially just a rectangle if you reduce it to its simplest. And it's divided into two parts. There's a big part and there's a little part. The big part is where the benches would be, or the pews, or in the early church where people would just stand during Mass. The smaller part was where the altar would be. Okay? The lower part was called the nave. It comes from a Latin word for ship. Think of the ship of Christ kind of sailing through the troubled seas of life with all of us aboard as passengers. The sanctuary, where the altar is, comes from the Latin word for holy. It's the holy place. And these two were separated from one another. Symbolically, the nave represents the world, and the sanctuary represents heaven. So one way to think about a church in very simple terms is it's a place where heaven and earth touch each other. In the early church, the separation between those two was marked by a series of columns called a templon. Here's a little church in Rome, Santa Maria in Cosmedina. It's one of the oldest churches in Rome, and it still has one of these templons. So you can see these pillars with this marker. On this side of it, in the front side, in the nave, is where people would sit, the congregation, and then the back would be where the clergy would sit. Over time, that began to change shape. In the western part of the church, it gradually got shorter and shorter and shorter until it became a railing, okay? The altar rail. So if you went into most Western Catholic churches, for example, or Episcopal churches or many other Protestant churches, you'd see an altar rail, separating the two parts of the church. When the Catholic Church had its Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, many of these things were removed. So now, the separation between the nave and the sanctuary is marked by the equivalent of the invisible plane at the goal line of an NFL game. Okay. In the Eastern Church, on the other hand, go back for a second, they developed the tradition of putting icons in here. And so in the Eastern Church, that grew into what's called the Iconostasis. It's a wall of icons that separates the nave from the sanctuary. Okay. So this idea of these railings that separate these two things goes all the way back to the 4th century. Now, I said that Flavius is making the church the official religion of the Roman Empire had consequences. Well, one of which is if you allow the clergy to be exempt from taxes and exempt from work requirements and so on, that can stimulate vocations. And so in these large churches, these basilicas, and in cathedrals, they developed groups of monks and nuns who lived there, and priests, and you had to accommodate them, and you had to accommodate them in the sanctuary. Well, you can't sort of pack them all cheek by jowl in the sanctuary, so to accommodate them, what they did was they added extensions to the sanctuary. These are called transepts, okay? And so, again, the lay people would be sitting in here, the priests and the monks would all be sitting in here, and then somebody looked at this and said, that looks just like a cross, okay? And that began the idea, well, first of all, here's what a typical church would have looked like, I should say. There's the sanctuary, there's the apse, that's the place where the bishop would have sat. And then there were these two side aisles, that was about the best I could do for columns. But someone said, that looks like a crucifix. And that was the idea of a cruciform church. This is Chartres Cathedral in France. And you can see, here's the transept, here's the main axis, and it looks like a cross. So it's not the first time that the church has taken something like an architectural motif and said, let's kind of retroactively baptize this. It wasn't like somebody said, hey, let's build a church that looks like a cross. They built a church first and then said, hey, this looks like a cross. Now, as you begin to build bigger and taller buildings, you run into a problem. And the problem is that the roof exerts pressure on the walls. Think about if you and I were standing next to each other and someone said, could you lift up this 400-pound television set? And we held it like this. Well, sooner or later you start to kind of go like this. You begin to sag. That's what happens to the walls of these big buildings. They begin to bulge outward. And if they bulge enough, of course, they collapse. So how do you prevent that? Well, you prevent it by doing two things. Number one, you make the walls thicker. Number two, you kind of help push it. So it's like calling a friend and saying, would you lean on my back so I don't bulge quite as much? So what they would do is that they would actually build another kind of half arch over here so that the weight would push on the upper part of the walls, and that would keep it from collapsing. And that's the classic cutaway of a Romanesque church. There's the central aisle here, the nave, and then these two side aisles. Okay. This is the Basilica of St Ambrose in Milan. Dates the late 4th century. And there are some interesting things to look at. I want to come over here to show you. Here is the main part. So this is the nave here. There would be two side aisles here. The part over here with this kind of turret on it is where the altar would be. Extra windows to let in light. Bell tower to call the faithful to worship, also to signal in times of disaster. And then there would be an atrium in the front, an open area. It was kind of like a yard with a fountain in it. In the early days in the church, if you wanted to become a member of the church, you couldn't just sort of show up and pay your dues. Okay? You had to be instructed first. And back in the days when Christianity was illegal, they were very, very careful about who they told what was going on in the church, because you never knew when the person who said he was going to wanted to be a Christian was an informant. And so there was a period of about 3 years of instruction. So they'd reveal a little bit of information to you. They'd watch you for a while to make sure you were trustworthy, and eventually you'd be admitted to full membership in the church. People who were studying to be Christians but were not full members of the church were called catechumens. They could go into this atrium area. They could go into the Mass, but only for part of it. And then before the consecration, they would come out and they would meet with teachers in this area for instruction. Okay? And in the early days, of course, when you came to church, your feet were dusty. And so you would wash your hands and feet in this fountain. And that persisted for a long time. Here's a Romanesque church plan. Again, the apse, the bishop's chair, the sanctuary, the nave, the atrium, and this fountain of ablution. And early Christian churches were usually built on an east-west axis. There's a good reason for this. It goes back to prehistory. Imagine yourself in Paleolithic days, okay, way back when. When night fell, scary things would come out looking for something to eat, and you were on the menu. So people hid in their caves and they waited. And when the light began to dawn, they knew they'd made it to another day. And so gradually, the idea of the West became associated with danger and darkness and sin, and the East was light and safety and hope. So, when you walked into a church with its main door at the west end, whether you realized it or not, you were turning your back on the West, on darkness and sin, and walking toward the light. That's the trajectory of the Christian life, from darkness to light. Now, over time, there was a transition from adult baptism to infant baptism. When you have lots and lots of Catholics producing lots and lots of babies, they have to be baptized. There aren't too many adults being baptized. So first of all, you have many fewer catechumens. You don't need the atrium anymore. Okay? And what happened was gradually the atrium was moved from the front of the church over to the side to become the cloister, where the priests and monks and nuns could gather and pray. And the little fount of ablution was moved out of the atrium into the inside of the church and became the holy water font. So if you go into a Catholic church and you stop and you look inside the door and you dip your finger in the holy water font, what you're doing is a continuation of what the early Christians would have done when they first came to church to wash the dirt off their feet and remind themselves of what they were about to do. This is the cloister of the Church of Saint Trophime in Arles, in the south of France. And this is a good idea of what a cloister looks like. It would be a central garden area, and then around it would be a series of covered arches where people could walk. If you've ever been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in Fort Tryon Park, there's a branch of the museum called the Cloisters. And it's a series of cloisters that were brought over from Europe and reconstructed. And they have some really beautiful gardens in there. Here's a smaller one. This is from the Church of San Damiano in Assisi. And again, you can see these archways where people could stand and pray and read their Gospels, or they could come out and enjoy the sun for a little bit. Now, there was a big problem with Romanesque churches. And I said that because you had to worry about the weight of the roof, they had to have really thick walls. So they had really thick walls. They had kind of very narrow windows, so they were very dark. This is a picture of an apse from a Romanesque church. You can see how narrow those windows are and how dark it is. Okay? Ideally, you'd like your churches to be a little bit lighter, because again, for most of history, there was no electricity. So the only light you had in churches were from the occasional candle or from the light coming in from outside. So how do you get around this business of not too many windows and very thick walls? The person who solved this problem was a man named Abbot Suger, who was the abbot of the Basilica of Saint Denis. Saint Denis is about 6 or 7 miles outside of Paris. He had been reading the Gospel, the letters of St. John, and in St. John's letters, he talks a lot about God being light. One way to think about a saint, for example, is to think about a person who has lived their life in such a way that they become transparent to the light of God, kind of like a stained glass window that all the dirt's been removed from. And so he was thinking about this, and he realized that he could get more light into churches by modifying the Roman arch. He developed what's now called the Gothic Arch. What's a Gothic arch? A Gothic arch, in comparison to a Roman arch, is a pointed arch. This is the Church of Saint Severin. It's right at the edge of the Latin Quarter in Paris. And this is a really good example of a Gothic arch. It seems like a trivial difference, but it turns out to be really revolutionary. This revolutionized the construction of churches. Why? Because if you take that opening and you say, what would a Roman arch look like there? Here's what it would look like. Okay? For the same width, a Gothic arch, first of all, is much higher than a Roman arch. So you can build churches that are really tall. One of the definitions of prayer is lifting the mind and heart to God. And so a tall church kind of helps you mentally because it draws your eye upward. But even more important is the fact that remember I said in the Gothic arch there's a little bit of a horizontal area here where gravity really works on the roof. This eliminates that. That means that there's essentially no flat area here, so you can build even bigger arches and wider ones. Sorry. Okay, so you have more outward thrust on the walls. One way to get rid of that, not with thicker walls, but with ribs. Okay, if you go back to these arches, sorry about this. What happens with these arches is that all of the downward force on the top of this arch gets transferred to these pillars. And so instead of having it transferred into a wall here, you can leave this open and all the weight of the roof is on these pillars. So you can replace really thick walls with really big pillars, but that opens the walls up. Bear with me, I don't know why this is doing this, but. So what they did was, in addition to these ribs, they would put them into the wall, so around the windows, which meant you could make wider windows. You could make taller windows, so all the weight of the roof rests on the pillars and not on the walls. That means you could open the walls up. Here's a good example. This is a little church called Saint Julien le Pauvre in Paris. It's right across the river from Notre-Dame. And if you look at it, you can see all these ribs crossing back and forth over one another. Those ribs are actually the things that are carrying all the stress in the roof. And what looks like solid wall there is just a thin layer of plaster, or maybe a thin layer of stone. So you had these arches which carried all the weight of the building and lots of open space in the walls. Okay? That meant you could fill them with windows, which meant lots and lots of light could come into the church. And as I said before, your eyes are drawn upward, but you can fill the windows with stained glass. The reason that that's important is that stained glass is not a fashion choice. It's because, remember, the printing press wasn't invented till the mid-1400s. Before that time, all books were handwritten. Okay? I once was talking to a group of middle school kids and I said, imagine if you wanted the latest, well, this was a few years ago, if you wanted the latest Harry Potter novel, 800 pages. And you can't just, and you went to Barnes and Noble and you said, I'd like to order one. And they'd say, okay, they'd point to some monk and some monk would sit down and start handwriting this thing. Okay? Books are they're very hard to produce. They were slow, they were expensive, and most people couldn't read. So if you wanted to instruct people in what Christian life was supposed to be about, you only had two choices: orally, through homilies and sermons and so on, and visually. And so stained glass windows evolved to teach people in a visual way what Christianity was all about. And Gothic arches allowed them to do that in their churches. To make the difference, the point about the difference between what Gothic churches look like and what Romanesque churches look like, this is the Basilica of St. Mary Magdalene in Vézelay, France, in Burgundy. And the front part is the nave, and that's a Romanesque. And you can see how dark it is. At some point, they replaced the old Romanesque nave with a Gothic nave, and you can see how much brighter it is. So Gothic churches were much, much brighter. All right, couple of great Gothic churches. Notre-Dame of Paris. This is an aerial view from the side. And again, it's tough to see here, but these are the transepts right here. And so this is one of those cruciform churches. The main entrance is on the left, and the back is on the right. It's an enormous church. The towers are 226 feet high. The nave is 39 feet wide, and inside it's about 200 feet high. So if you stand in the nave there and you look up, the width of the nave in comparison to the height is about a factor of 10 to 1. So it looks like it's long and thin and narrow, and your eyes are just naturally drawn upward. Here's what it looks like on the inside. You can see what I mean about how much higher it is, and your eye just sort of naturally drifts upward. So it really engenders a sense of lifting your heart up to God. But look at the size of those pillars. They're enormous pillars, and they're the ones that bear all the weight of the church. But you also need support from outside, so you'll see these big buttresses that sit outside, and their function is to keep the wall from bulging outside. In the back of the church, they invented what were called flying buttresses. Instead of clustering them next to the windows and blocking the light, they have come out kind of like insect feet almost. It's kind of interesting when you walk up behind the church like this, it almost looks like you're looking at a gigantic insect kind of sitting there in the middle of the street. Here's the front, and it's very ornate. Okay, these niches, the entrance to the front, are filled with statuary that all tell something about Christian belief. And then above it is this row. There's an interesting story about this row. This row represents the kings of Israel and Judah. But in the French Revolution, when the crowds attacked the church, they thought they were the kings of France. And so they did what French people did during the Revolution. They tore them down and they beheaded them all. And they threw them all into a lime pit. So the ones that are up there now are reproductions, and the original pieces have been reunited in their Museum of Medieval Art. Okay, here's the main doorway, and you can see the figure of Christ, and an angel flanking him on either side, and a whole bunch of figures here. And you can actually go through and you can kind of piece together basic principles about salvation history from this. But inside are all these gigantic stained glass windows. To give you a sense of size, if you look at these, let's say this little block right here, that's 4 feet by 4 feet. So these windows are something like 40 feet wide by probably 60 feet high. And they just ring the entire church. So when you walk inside, it's impossible not to see them. In the transepts, there are huge, great rose windows, stained glass windows. They're 42 feet high. 42 feet wide, rather. And again, if you had a pair of binoculars, you could stand there and you could piece together stories from the Bible about them. And that's not an accident. In addition, remember how the general shape of the church is almost like U-shaped? You know, it's like a path that goes around. One of the things that early Christians hoped to do was to make a visit to the Holy Land, to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. But for a lot of people, that was impractical. It was impractical because if you had a family to take care of, you couldn't do that. If you were poor, you couldn't do that. Once the Holy Land fell to Islam, you couldn't do that either. So people tried to develop the tradition of pilgrimages. Europe was just filled with pilgrimage routes. So people would walk to the various churches, the famous churches, to see the relics that they had. And their ultimate destination is most often the Church of Santiago de Compostela in Spain, which had what was supposed to be the relics of St. James. Well, if you did that, people still do that today, but it's a work of months if you want to do the whole thing. If you don't have time to do that, you can make what's called a symbolic pilgrimage. So you could walk into a church, and you can still do this in Notre-Dame today. You walk down one side of the aisle, around the back of the altar, and then back out again. And if you think back to the Roman Basilica, I said there are all these little shops along the way. Well, in a Christian church, they're replaced by altars, little chapels dedicated to various saints. And so you could stop at these saints and pray. One of my colleagues called it a spiritual bazaar. And you can make that a symbolic pilgrimage. The other thing, and also, by the way, we tend to think of churches as kind of drab. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But medieval churches were filled with color. And in Notre-Dame, around the altar area on the sides are these polychrome reliefs. So here's, again, Jesus calling the apostles to become fishers of men. Now, other big churches, Chartres Cathedral. This is an enormous cathedral. You can see this from probably 10 miles away. And we used to go there with our students. We'd be on the bus, and at some point, all of a sudden, you could see way in the distance this little spire coming up. And you'd be like, as I said, a good 10 miles away from this thing. But you could see how it would tower over the roofs of the houses. Chartres Cathedral is like a little miracle all in itself. When the French Revolution came along, they destroyed large numbers of churches. And Chartres Cathedral was supposed to be demolished. But before they decided to demolish it, they said, well, what are we going to do with all this stone? And so they do what politicians always do. They set up a committee. And the committee met and met and met and did nothing. And so the church survived. So this is Chartres Cathedral. As I said, it's an enormous cathedral. Its towers are 340 and 370 feet high. You can see there are two different ones because they were added at two different points in time. This one's added about 300 years later than this one did. The thing that's unique about Chartres Cathedral is that it's an example of one of the other functions that cathedrals served in the Middle Ages. The first universities didn't really begin till about 1100 or so. So before that, there were no universities. So whatever training went on either went on in monasteries or in cathedral schools. And so Chartres became the seat of a cathedral school. The other thing that drew people to Chartres in large numbers was the holy relic. They had a relic that was called the Sancta Kamisha. It was a piece of silk about 15 feet long that was popularly believed to be the robe that Mary wore when she gave birth to Jesus. And so people would come from all around to see this. It also fell victim to the French Revolution. This is all that survives of it. But as I said, people would be drawn to do this. People would go to, for example, in Paris, they'd go to La Sainte-Chapelle, which had what was supposed to be the crown of thorns. So every big church had something. Relics were big business in the Middle Ages. They were in large numbers. There are at least 4 churches, for example, that claim to have the head of John the Baptist. We were in England a few years ago. We were at the Tower of London, and there was this very funny beefeater taking us around, and he was talking about the fact that there are all these churches that have, the head of John the Baptist, and he said, I don't know much about John the Baptist, but one thing I'm pretty sure of is he only had one head. But in any case, this is one of the relics that you can venerate when you go there. The other thing that's interesting is that in the floor is built this labyrinth. And you see these in a lot of big churches. Now, there are 2 things that get confused a lot of times. One is a maze. A maze is something that's designed to confuse you. You know, a maze, you probably did puzzles like this when you were kids. You find the middle of the maze. There are all these paths, almost none of which lead to the center. Only one leads to the center. Okay. A labyrinth, on the other hand, has a single pathway that leads you inevitably to the center. So you start, in this case, you start down here, you walk up, you take a left, and then you keep walking, and you keep going, and eventually you do get to the center. Now, that was a way for people to make a symbolic pilgrimage. You could walk this, as these folks are doing, And you could pray as you went to the center. And one of the things about a labyrinth is that it has a hypnotic quality to it. Not because it's a drug, but just because you sort of forget what's going on around you after a while. And you kind of enter into this sort of quiet, meditative space, so that by the time you get to the center and you come back out again, you really sort of feel refreshed. This was called the Road to Jerusalem in France. Now, Chartres, as I said, was one of the big schools of Europe. It was presided over by a man named Fulbert, who taught at the Cathedral School. And under his leadership, and later when he became a bishop, it developed into one of the premier cathedral schools of Europe. And as it was being built, what they did with it was that they filled the outside with sculpture and they filled the inside with stained glass windows, and it became essentially a large book. It was the library of the cathedral school. So here's one of the porches, and again you can see all these figures, and they're arranged in such a way that there are figures from the Old Testament on one side and figures from the New Testament on the other side, and they sort of relate to one another in some symbolic way. St. Augustine once said that the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so there was a lot of energy that went into trying to relate these two things. Here's some sculptures. On the left of this doorway on the north porch, there are several sculptures of patriarchs. So if you start on the extreme left, there's Melchizedek, the priest who met Abraham and gave him wine and water. Next to him is Abraham. Next to him, I'll skip over him. And then it culminates in David. And on this side are prophets. So this is Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on all the way down. And so there's every effort made in the placement of things to relate the Old Testament to the New Testament. But the real glory for my money is the stained glass windows. There are 176 stained glass windows, 25,000 square feet of stained glass. There's an enormous, and it's a library. Okay, here's an example of some of the stained glass. Let's talk about one window. It's called the Good Samaritan window. Again, this window is probably about 24 feet by 50 feet. And it's divided into roughly two parts. The lower part down here tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And the upper part tells what's essentially a commentary on it by a man named Isidore of Seville, who talks about the spiritual significance of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And you read these windows from bottom to top and then left to right. So here's the parable of the Good Samaritan. On the top left, man starts out on a journey. Along the way, he encounters some thieves. You can see them kind of getting their swords ready to attack him. They attack him and leave him for dead. While he's laying there, a priest and a Levite walk by, and they're all very busy on God's business, so they just leave him there. Along comes a Samaritan. The Samaritans were the lowest of the low, according to the Jews, because they were fallen away. They were pagans. He stops, picks the man up, puts him on his animal, brings him to an inn, takes care of him, and then leaves money with the innkeeper and says, "I'll pay you the rest when I come back." If you read the top half of the window, which we're not going to do, what it does is it says, this is just like in the New Testament what Christ does. People come into the world, they fall into sin, they get expelled from paradise, they start out on their journey. Along their way, they fall prey to all these ills. All of the good people who are supposed to help them just pass them by. Along comes the Samaritan. What's the Samaritan? Well, if you read the book of Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah, it talks about the Messiah being despised and rejected. Christ is the Samaritan. He picks them up, he tends to his wounds, he brings them to a place and says, take care of him. He leaves them with the church. I'm coming back, and when I come back, I'll repay everything I owe. So those windows, people would spend years studying those windows in preparation for clerics. Now, one last point. I said that we tend to think of cathedrals as sort of dark places, but in fact, we know now that they were painted. Every surface was painted, and after exhaustive research in Chartres Cathedral, they found traces of paint. And so, over the last 10 years, they've been repainting the cathedral. Imagine a cathedral of the size we're talking about, filled with this color. When you walked into the cathedral from outside in Middle Ages, you were literally walking into a different world. And in the Middle Ages, things were pretty grim. People lived, lives of quiet, maybe not quiet, desperation. They didn't have any money. They had short lives. They were prey to all kinds of ills, from savagery to diseases. When you walked into a church, all of a sudden you were surrounded by light and color and all of these messages telling you that there was a better world waiting for you, that there was strength that you could draw on. Well, this is kind of the high point of cathedral building. Cathedral building keeps going on, but the basic pattern remains the same. Cathedrals get more and more elaborate. Every square inch is decorated with all kinds of kitschy things, at least for my taste. But today, if you look at the churches we go into today, if you look closely enough, okay, if you look and don't just see, you'll see traces of all of the things we talked about. Okay, that font of evolution that you can find when you walk into the church, the altar rail, the windows, everything there is there for a purpose. And so if you really want to enrich your view of what it is to go into a church, go in with new eyes, as St. George said, and take a look and see what no one else has seen before. Here's some more photos of the restoration of the cathedral. This is the ceiling. And this is our little church in Medway, Massachusetts. And I show this because this is actually standing at the altar looking toward the back, and you can see this big Gothic arch. This is the main aisle, and in the side aisles you can just see the curvature of those side ones. So the past is very much with us today. Okay. So a church, in some ways, if you look closely at it, is not just a container that a bunch of people walk into to do something. It's more like a memory box. So anyway, that's the story of cathedrals. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you.